Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Getting In, a college coach conversation. Welcome to our sort of Brady Bunch group here. That's what it looks a little to me like for those who are watching this versus listening to it. Um, you might be wondering, well, gee, Ian is here, Sally's here, Shannon's here. Since when do all of these people join on one segment? Well, when we are celebrating a massive milestone in Getting In, a college coach conversation, and that is 8 years of doing this weekly podcast, which is sort of amazing to think about. But the first episode aired on February 5th, 2015. And for anyone who's interested, it is in the archives if you want to go back and take a listen. I actually spoke with a mom yesterday who has just started listening to the podcast, and she started with episode number 1.
Oh my gosh.
I suggested that she might want to start with the most recent episode and work backwards because that's a lot of episodes, 52 a year, actually 51, because we every Thanksgiving we repeat one of our episodes, so we don't actually record one. But otherwise, this is a weekly show, and that makes for a lot of episodes in the archive. So, as I mentioned, welcome to my guests, Sally Ganga, Shannon Vasconcelos, Ian Fisher. Thanks, you guys, for being here.
We're so glad to be here. By the way, Beth, I hope I'm not derailing this too much, but you told me I was the first guest on the first segment, which I had forgotten. And I remembered that I didn't have the best setup at home, and I didn't want to go into the office for just 15 minutes. So I was literally like sitting on my bed because that's where the internet was the best, like on the phone, looking through notes. My setup is a little bit better now, so that's nice.
A little better, although we probably should share with our listeners that Sally was having a microphone issue right before we got started, and she did say I could time her out. What's the issue? It wasn't plugged in, so go figure.
Exactly.
We've gotten really good at this, but maybe not as good as, but believe me, we have all had our moments when we're on the show. And as I think back to some of those early days, so the first segment aired, we had agreed to do 13. So you do sort of segments of 13 unless you decide you want to commit and do the show for the full year. And we thought, well, let's just try it. And for those first 13 episodes, the first 13 episodes, I was the host for every single one of them. And I didn't have a producer. So I was corralling the guests and thinking through like, what should we talk about? And, tapping people to help me with that. But I was doing all of it. And I am not at all ashamed to say that I don't do any of that. Like basically I show up when they tell me to show up now. And I love that. That is a nice change for me. But one screw up I will mention is that in one of those early shows, and I don't know exactly which one, but I bet if you listened, you might be able to pick the one out. I didn't prepare for it at all. So I do a little prep before every one of these shows, and I have some notes for myself and, introductions and things like that. But I just completely went in and was like, oh, I'll figure it out. I was late getting back to my home where my setup was, and I just didn't have time to do it. And it was terrible. And I swore I would never do it again. And unlike those all-nighters I pulled in college to write papers, I literally never did do it again. So that was a lesson learned.
I really want to go back now and see if I can pick that one out. I think that's a challenge to our listeners.
All right, do it. Like I said, I feel like it should be obvious, but I don't know. You tell me after you listen to them.
You know what Sally just reminded me of when she said that she called from her phone on her bed to that first episode. It was up until fairly recently, but I had already forgotten that we used to call in by phone.
Yes.
Nowadays, we do it all over Zoom. We can see each other. And I had completely spaced, and that's only been the past 2-3 years, something like that.
Yeah.
I completely spaced that we used to not be able to see each other. This is so much nicer.
It is totally.
It's really changed things for me in terms of preparation because, it used to be the guest was on, but they were only on audio. And so I could pretend like they weren't really there. And I would script the introduction and I'd have all this stuff that I was ready to say. And now I'm like, well, my guest is already sitting here. I guess we got to get right into it and jump right into the segment, which is probably better for the listeners, right? A little bit less of me pontificating with my pre-prepared remarks and instead just jumping right into the content. So I think it's made for more efficient utilization of our time. And I guess people now know what we look like too, and all of our
Yeah.
guests look like. So there's some
That
advantages.
could be
to that.
good or
There are.
bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Interestingly, there was definitely trepidation about the idea of being on camera.
Yeah.
And some people on our team were sort of, I don't think I want to be on camera. But what I found since then is that maybe because we do so many more video calls now and it's become such a part of our lives, nobody these days says, no, I'm not comfortable being on camera. You don't have to be on camera to be a guest. We like it if you are willing to, but we're fine if someone just doesn't want to. But I've not had anybody make that request since then. And we probably should have gone back and checked this, but I feel like we've been doing the video for a while. Maybe it has only been a couple of years.
I thought it started right around when COVID started.
It might have.
Right.
Because I remember a lot of change happening all at once, and we were like, should we throw this on people too? Sure, why not? Everybody, come on video. We want to see your
Exactly.
faces since we can't see you any other times. We were all locked in our houses.
Yeah, exactly. And what I hate is when, and I have been a few times in a place where the internet just doesn't support me being on camera. And then, so we're not on camera. That's like, it's definitely harder. And Ian, to your point, I had a guest on recently who had been a guest on the show a few years ago when we weren't doing video. And it was such a better conversation because you're able to see each other. And so you can see when the other person is done speaking or when the other person is ready to ask a question. And, for our listeners, maybe we're a little more in the weeds than you need to be right now, but these are the things that make us happy about this. But let me bring it back to some things that I think will be of interest to our listeners. And so, Sally, we already talked about, you were our very first guest on the podcast. And you and I discussed what I think all would consider one of the age-old questions as far as college admissions is considered. Shannon will get to the age-old question on the finance side here shortly, and that is whether it's better to have a B in honors or an A in college prep. And so, can you give us a short version and give us your take on, has that changed? Has your answer changed or evolved any since we had that conversation?
I'm kind of wondering if you've met me, Beth, since you're asking about a short version, but I'll do my best.
Fair.
The funny thing is, I actually had this exact conversation this morning on a phone call. But yeah, basically, I have not changed anything of what I would have said before. Like, it's better to get a B in an AP than an A in college prep. However, if you have to struggle so much to maintain that B that the rest of your grades suffer too, then you need to really think about it carefully.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think at the end of the day, one thing that our listeners have heard, if they've heard nothing else, they have certainly heard it depends. And I think this is a great example of that, right? Because yes, this one is better, but it does depend. And then, there are schools where the B in the AP is not going to fly, but an A in the college prep wouldn't fly either. So, like you need to take the AP and you need to get an A in it. And that's the reality there. So,
right. But the good news is I'm sorry, go ahead, Ian.
I was just going to say I had this same conversation with one of my students just last night. And I think the answer is the same. But one of the things over the last 8 years is my way of answering that question has become different. The different examples I'll use, the analogies that I'll draw. But, it's a good reminder that the people that have been finding our conversation, I don't think we have any listeners who started on day one and have been with us the entire time. That would be a little bit unusual for somebody to be that committed to college admissions advice. And so we do have to keep coming back to these kinds of questions because they are fresh for the next student that we're talking to. And it's nice that some of these answers don't change because there is a lot of variance across our field.
Yeah, totally. Shannon, you had something, I think.
I'm taking us on a side note, but it just made me think of it when you said, we've said it depends many times over the past 8 years. I am now wondering, I've got another challenge for our listeners. Go back and find the first instance of it depends. And I would guess it might be in that very first episode because it is so ubiquitous to this process. But I think in honor of our 8th anniversary, I want to make another ask of our listeners. I want to see hashtag it depends trending on Twitter. That is my goal to celebrate this anniversary. Come on, folks, help us out.
Did you do the dishes? Well, it depends.
What do you mean by do? Do you mean I looked at them or
Yeah.
put them in the sink?
I put
They're
them in the
soaking?
sink. I did the
Took some
dishes.
action.
They are
Sure.
in the sink.
Shout out to Pink if anyone follows Pink on Instagram, and she called out her husband for leaving a
Yes.
dish in the sink soaking, and she's like, I'm on to you. I know what this means. It'll be here for 3 days until I clean it. So yes, did you do the dishes? He thinks yes, she thinks no. So it depends.
It depends.
Which leads me to my next question, and this one's for you, Shannon. And I feel like you and I say that a lot because we do the Q&A frequently. But our second show featured who qualifies for financial aid, which I think is another. It may be not quite the ubiquitous question as the A in college prep versus B in honors is, but it's a big one. And so I'm curious, what's your answer, and what, if anything, has changed about that?
I'm going to say the answer has not changed a tremendous amount over the past 8 years, but it's about to.
Interesting.
Because, and if you're a regular listener, you've heard us reference this a number of times, there's going to be a big change to the financial aid process coming, starting with the 24-25 school year. So that's actually, you're applying for financial aid for the 24-25 school year in the fall of 23. So this is coming up starting this upcoming October. The government has decided to, what they call it FAFSA simplification, which puts a lovely positive spin on it. And there are lots of lovely positive things about it. They are shortening the FAFSA from its current, I think it's 108 questions to only 36 questions. So it will be much simpler to fill out, which is wonderful for families. A number of other changes are accompanying that nice positive change, however, and they're not all going to be great for families. So folks who may have qualified for financial aid in the past might not, based upon some of these changes that are happening. And I think the biggest one, and we have referenced it on the show before, is the federal financial aid calculations are going to no longer split a parent's contribution between all of the kids that they have in college. So, right now, if you fill out the FAFSA, they calculate this number called your expected family contribution. Maybe that number comes out to be $30,000 when you have one child in school. And then the next year, your younger child also goes to school. You have two in college. That $30,000 contribution becomes $15,000 apiece because it acknowledges that you're paying for more than one child. It makes sense that your money can't go to, all of it can't go to both kids at the same time. It's a limited resource. So the current financial aid formula acknowledges that fact, splits your money between your two kids. With FAFSA simplification, that splitting is going away. So if you had a $30,000 contribution when your first child goes to college, you will still have a $30,000 contribution for them, plus another $30,000 for your younger child. And God forbid you have more than two, because it just keeps adding up. So that's where I think families are going to feel the biggest effect. There are some other changes. Also, small business owners, small family-owned businesses are currently excluded from the FAFSA calculations. They are not going to be under FAFSA simplification. So that's another tough one for families. There are some good changes. They're no longer going to be looking at untaxed income for the most part on your FAFSA. So money you contributed to your 401k, it would be included, currently is included as part of your income. Now it looks like it's not going to be. We still haven't seen the final new FAFSA yet. So there's still some question marks about something. So it's a mixed bag with this FAFSA simplification. So that, again, as of today, not a whole lot has changed about who's going to qualify for financial aid. The formula has essentially been the same. The last major change was in the 1990s. But we've got a big one coming up soon. And so we will keep folks informed as we know more. We get more guidance from the Department of Education, which we are expecting throughout the spring and summer. We're going to keep folks informed.
Right. And just really quickly for our listeners' edification, you qualify for financial aid based on income, correct?
Correct.
And
income is
the
absolutely the major driver of the formula.
Right.
Assets play a very small role. So that's, another common question in the work that we all do, and specifically what I do, why should I save for college? It's just going to cost me financial aid. And the truth is that it does not cost you much financial aid. Whatever you save helps you much more than the small limited loss of financial aid that it may cause.
Well,
Right.
especially if you think about the interest rates, you'll be paying off those loans otherwise.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean,
And that's, in the paying for college world, the financial aid formula has stayed pretty static, but, paying for college changes a lot from year to year, like with the economy, what's happening with your investments. If they're doing well, it's a whole lot easier to pay for college. What happens when interest rates go up? It's a whole lot harder to pay for college because borrowing is going to cost you a whole lot more. Interest rates are on the rise. So that's going to be another tough pill to swallow for families, unfortunately, for the near future.
yes, it is. And I think one of the big things for me, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I just always want families to be thoughtful, to really think about what they can afford and just be smart about that, because, I believe very strongly, and I believe everyone on this call agrees with me, that college is important, it is valuable, it is worth it. But there are a lot of options out there that don't mean you're going to have to go into significant debt. But you have to be smart about what those options are. But
Yes.
Beth, last
can I
week's
give
show actually was fantastic. We had a couple of alumni from the CSU system who were on talking a little bit about their decision to choose CSUs actually over the UCs.
Oh,
in both
interesting.
cases.
Yeah.
And cost was a big part of it. And they had some great stories about their current professional careers, and they are thriving. And it's a really great reminder that you don't have to go to the glitziest, glossiest institution, but you got to make a holistic decision about those opportunities.
Right,
I just want
exactly.
to specify that you're speaking about Cal State's compared to University of California system.
That's right. That's right. But our fans who listened last week, they'll know because we unpacked
yeah. If you listened to last week,
and if they didn't,
think about like Colorado State, for example.
That's true.
So.
If they didn't listen, they can go back and listen now because you can get the archives.
Yeah.
Shannon, you look like you had something.
Yeah,
else.
no, I want to give us some props for I don't know that it was in the very first episode, but from very early on, we decided that there would be a finance segment in every single one of our episodes. So I want to give us all props for that, for putting finance sort of at the forefront of this admissions process and acknowledging that it's extremely important to families, and we're going to include it in every single episode. And I think certainly a lot of admissions consultants don't do that. Other admissions podcasts don't necessarily do that.
No, it's true.
So I want to give us credit for doing so. And, there's no other purchase of this size that you enter into without thinking about, what I can afford. But I think people do that a lot with college. And so I'm proud of us for acknowledging the importance of the financial factor every one of our episodes.
Can I jump in though? I always like to emphasize that the wealthier institutions, a low-income student might actually be better off going to them. I mean, Ian and I both went to Reed, and this was a few years ago, but I think Christine was the one who told me this, that the average indebtedness of the student who attended Reed, who was in the lower income bracket, compared to Oregon State, which is a much lower cost institution by the numbers, actually they came out of Reed with much less debt.
Yeah.
And the Ivies, for example, have committed to no debt. So I just always like to stress, go ahead and apply to some of those expensive institutions, but make sure you have the public institutions in there as well, and the institutions that will give you some merit scholarship also.
Right.
Yeah, I think I don't think it's the entire reason, but part of the reason why cost tends not to be at the forefront when you enter this process is because it is impossible to tell right up front what a college is going to cost you. It's not like a house or a car, there may be some negotiation involved, but the general price range of the product, whereas with college, you don't if you don't do your due diligence. And we've talked about kind of how to do that on a lot of our episodes, but the sticker price for most people is absolutely meaningless.
Yeah,
and
it's true.
It all depends on your finances, what financial aid you qualify for, and your academics and other factors, how badly a college wants to recruit you. That's what's going to determine your scholarship eligibility. So it is extremely difficult for families to know upfront what a college will cost them. And so that absolutely throws an added challenge to this already challenging process.
Yes. Well, you mentioned that we've included finance in virtually every episode, and I believe we have, except for episode 1. And the reason that finance wasn't in episode 1 is because we were still figuring out the format. We were going with 2 segments a show instead of what we now typically do is 3. Today we're doing 2. But in that very first show, Ian, we had one of the test prep companies that we work closely with, Revolution Prep, came on as a guest, and we talked about the new SAT that was going to be rolling out that year. And so obviously standardized testing has changed some, and I was curious to get your take on, so that new SAT rolled out in 2015, but what do you see that has changed and the highlights, and then what do you think the future is? I want you to look into your crystal ball and figure it out for us.
Yeah. Okay. I can try that.
Okay.
It was so funny. The new SAT was such a topic of conversation. And then in about 2017, people just stopped saying new all of a sudden. And now it was just the SAT. And I frankly barely remember the change that came before to the after. There are still lots of changes that are happening in the standardized testing landscape, but we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that we went through a global pandemic in 2020 and are still in some ways living the effects of that. And that had a huge impact on the college application process, I think probably most notably felt with testing. We could come back and talk a little bit about learning loss and the effect of students in the classroom and having to have their coursework across Zoom. I think that that's been a really difficult challenge for just about everyone who's been in this space. But the testing is a really precise and kind of pronounced acute effect in terms of the pandemic. Schools couldn't require students to take the standardized tests because so many sittings were canceled. You think about getting a bunch of teenagers into a room in 2020 to take a proctored exam for 3.5 hours. That is a super spreader event right there, right? So it got canceled in most places. There are some notable exceptions, Florida, that were perfectly fine having students sit for the exams and continue to require those exams for Florida public universities. But a lot of colleges said, hey, here's a chance for us to take a shot and see if we actually need testing in order to make the decisions that we have long made. And so most schools went test optional. Some were temporarily test optional, but close to 90% of schools still have that policy in place. And it's been frankly wonderful for students. It gives them some real flexibility. I was talking to one of our test prep colleagues who said, students shouldn't ever be test optional because they should know how they're going to do on the exam and consider it as a potential for them to add strength. But schools are test optional. And so that gives them an enormous amount of control about how these exams fit into the process. And so, for those students who are anxious about testing, who might perceive that to be a weakness in their application, they are no longer bound to send those scores. And that's really, really different from how it was in 2019 and certainly how it was in, the late 90s and going on back. So SAT, ACT have become less important in the process. There is a little bit of clawing back of the SAT that is happening in some places. MIT is probably the most notable of these. They have said we are going to go ahead and require test scores going forward because we see a correlation between good scores and success in our academic programming. There are still public universities that are going to require test scores as well. But I think that a lot of schools are pretty pleased with what they've been able to do with test optional admissions. And I can just imagine being in that situation where you've got a great student whose scores might not be good. You don't have to say, let's put them on the wait list. Their scores are going to pull down our average. They can say, let's take this kid. We don't care what their scores might be because those numbers don't affect our average. They don't affect our rankings. And, somewhat tangential to this, the former president of Reed College, Colin Diver, is leading the vanguard against the rankings and has long been opposed to them. Reed has opted not to send data to the U.S. News and World Report rankings for as long as I've been affiliated with the college. And we're seeing actually some law schools that are pulling out of the rankings, graduate programs that are pulling out of sending these data to the rankings. And I think that if you see that trend continue, the value of testing is going to continue to diminish in the application process. It has a lot of externalities. So the question is, what can testing companies like the College Board or the ACT do to adjust the format of the exam to make it more obviously valuable or more obviously predictive for student success. And they're on the clock here. Like they really need to figure that out quickly. Or colleges are going to say, we don't really feel like we need you in this space. So I wouldn't be surprised if testing is gone by, the next 8 years from now, if it's just not a part of this process, it's just out. But you never know. The testing organizations might figure a way to keep students around.
Don't
Is
you think
that too bold?
Florida?
Like, what do you think?
Yeah.
Sally, do you think that that's
I just
realistic?
think Florida and the states like that are going to hang on to, because, it's what they went. I mean, I don't respect it as a decision, but I think there are people who see. I actually, way back in the day when I was at Whittier College, I actually wrote an article for the paper, a perspective of like the argument for going test optional. And it was interesting because the counterpoint was, of course, a student who did not work in admissions, but somehow he was able to say that the tests were as important as algebra, or something like that. And I think that there are people who feel that way, like, well, I went through it, so it must be important.
Yes.
I don't know. I have some sympathy for MIT. But I think like really Florida Atlantic can't read the applications without test scores.
Of course they can.
I don't believe it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I
The entire
agree.
Cal State system can. Like,
Yeah,
come on,
exactly.
guys.
The UCs can. UC
Right.
Berkeley.
Yes.
I think UC Berkeley's doing okay without test scores. So,
Yeah. I mean, I think we're a little bit preaching to the choir here on that front. I do recall standing in front of a crowd in my early time here at College Coach and someone asking, we see some schools are test optional, how far reaching do you think that's going to be? And saying, I think it would be great. I want to stress that if they are test optional, they really are. But we haven't seen a lot of schools fall in line. And so by the time your student applies, I don't think that will be super widespread. It was long enough ago that I believe I was right, that they weren't there for that student. But to whoever made the point that we then went into a pandemic, Ian, I think it was you, that was unprecedented. And that really did swing the pendulum so quickly in the opposite direction that none of us, we could never have foreseen that. So, again, I was asking for the crystal ball and I like it. I like your interpretation. Whether or not it comes to pass, I guess we'll all have to get together in 8 years.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. We'll
And
talk
see
about
it.
it on this show
And
along the
see.
way.
All right, we're going to take a really quick break. And when we come back, we're just basically going to do more of this and hopefully give you some good info alongside a little bit of reminiscing. So don't go away.